Imagine the sensation of air being replaced by perfume. Not the light, fleeting scent of a passing breeze in a garden, but a thick, cloying, physical presence that settles in the back of your throat. Imagine the color red, not as a sharp flash, but as a descending velvet curtain that obscures the floor, then the knees, then the waist of everyone in the room. In the year 218 AD, a group of Roman aristocrats found themselves in this exact position, standing in a dining hall where the ceiling had quite literally opened up to reveal a sky of falling flowers. To the casual observer, it was the ultimate gesture of imperial decadence, a poetic excess typical of the young man sitting on the gilded throne. But as the petals continued to fall, the poetry turned into physics, the fragrance became a vacuum, the beauty became a burial. This is the story of Elagabalus, the boy king who tried to turn the Roman Empire into a sanctuary for a sun god, and in doing so suffocated the very foundations of the eternal city under a blanket of blossoms. To understand how we arrived at a banquet where guests were crushed by roses, we must first look at the wreckage of the Severan dynasty. By the early 3rd century, the Roman Empire was no longer the stable, stoic machine of Augustus or Marcus Aurelius. It was a collection of competing ambitions, held together by the loyalty of the legions and the sheer willpower of the imperial family. When the Emperor Caracalla was assassinated in 217 AD by a disgruntled soldier, the throne was briefly seized by Macrinus, a man of humble origins who lacked the pedigree to keep it. In the eastern city of Emesa, in modern-day Syria, a woman named Julia Maesa watched these events with a cold, calculating eye. She was the sister-in-law of the late Septimius Severus and the aunt of the murdered Caracalla. She had seen the inner workings of power, and she was not prepared to spend her remaining years in quiet exile. Maesa had a plan, and that plan centered on her grandson, a 14-year-old boy named Varius Avitus Bassianus. To the people of Emesa, Varius was more than just a teenager. He was the hereditary high priest of the sun god Elagabal. He was often seen performing ecstatic dances around a massive, conical black stone that had supposedly fallen from the heavens. He was beautiful, he was exotic, and according to the whispers carefully planted by his grandmother, he was the secret illegitimate son of Caracalla himself. The rumor was a lie, but in the Roman world, a useful lie was often more powerful than a boring truth. Julia Maesa used her immense wealth to bribe the nearby Legio III Gallica, convincing the soldiers that the young priest was the true heir to the Severan line. On a spring morning in 218, the boy was proclaimed emperor under the name Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, though history would remember him by the name of his god, Elagabalus. The subsequent civil war against Macrinus was brief and decisive. At the Battle of Antioch, the boy priest supposedly charged into the fray on horseback, his purple robes flying behind him, inspiring the wavering troops to victory. Macrinus fled, was captured, and was executed. At 14 years old, the priest of the sun was now the master of the world. However, the Roman Senate, waiting nervously in the capital, had no idea what was coming. They expected a return to normalcy, perhaps a young boy who would be a puppet for his grandmother's wisdom. They were prepared for a Roman emperor. What they received was something entirely different. Elagabalus did not rush to Rome to pay his respects to the Senate or to sacrifice at the Temple of Jupiter. Instead, he spent the winter in Nicomedia, and when he finally began his slow procession toward Italy, he did so not as a general, but as a missionary. The centerpiece of his entourage was not a golden eagle or a display of captured weapons. It was the black stone of Emesa. The emperor had the meteor mounted on a chariot encrusted with gold and jewels. He refused to sit in the chariot himself. Instead, he walked backward in front of it for the entire journey, his eyes never leaving the sacred stone. His path cleared by servants who scattered gold dust and fine sand so his feet would never touch the common earth. When he finally entered Rome in 219, the citizens were treated to a spectacle that bordered on the hallucinatory. The emperor was not wearing the traditional woolen toga of a Roman citizen. He was dressed in flowing silks of purple and gold, his arms covered in heavy bracelets, his neck draped in pearls, and his face painted with thick cosmetics. To the Romans, who equated Eastern luxury with feminine weakness, this was more than a scandal, it was a cosmic disturbance. Elagabalus immediately began the work of upending the Roman religious order. He placed his sun god at the very top of the pantheon, ahead of Jupiter himself. He built a massive temple, the Elagabalus, on the Palatine Hill, and moved the most sacred relics of the Roman state there, the fire of the Vestal Virgins, the shields of Mars, and the Palladium. He claimed that all gods were merely servants of the sun, and he intended to marry his god to the Roman goddess Minerva, or later to the Carthaginian Tanit, to symbolize the union of the heavens. The emperor's personal life was no less shocking to the traditionalists. He married and divorced 5 women in quick succession, including a Vestal Virgin, an act that was traditionally punishable by death. He took a husband, a blonde carriage driver named Heracles, whom he referred to as his master and lord. The court of Elagabalus became a place of sensory overload. He was obsessed with the rare, the expensive, and the absurd. He would not eat fish unless it was served miles from the sea, nor would he eat meat that had not been cooked in exotic spices that cost more than a soldier's annual salary. He reportedly offered a vast sum of money to any physician who could perform a surgical gender reassignment, a request that was centuries ahead of its time and deeply confusing to his contemporaries. He filled his palace with lions and leopards that had been rendered harmless, letting them loose during banquets to terrify his guests for sport. He was a teenager with absolute power and a total lack of interest in the mechanics of governance. While Julia Maesa tried to handle the actual administration of the empire, her grandson was busy designing the perfect party. For Elagabalus, the banquet was not just a meal, it was a theater of the grotesque. He delighted in mock courses, where guests were served food made of wax, wood, or marble, and were expected to pretend to eat while the emperor watched with silent glee. He would seat guests on air cushions that were slowly deflated during the meal, leaving the dignified senator sliding onto the floor under the table. He was fascinated by the idea of excess leading to destruction. He loved the contrast between the delicate beauty of a flower and the overwhelming force of a mountain. As the year 221 AD bled into 222, the tension in Rome reached a breaking point. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers who protected the emperor, were growing tired of the painted boy priest who spent his days dancing and his nights in the arms of slaves. They looked towards his younger cousin, Alexander Severus, as a more traditional alternative. Elagabalus sensed the shift in the wind, but his response was not to change his behavior or seek a political compromise. His response was to host a banquet that would be remembered forever. He wanted to create an experience so beautiful that it would transcend the grime of Roman politics. He ordered his servants to gather every rose in the city and the surrounding countryside. He wanted a harvest of petals that would rival the sea. The guests were invited, the wine was poured, and the hidden mechanisms in the ceiling were loaded. The sun was setting on his reign, but before it went down, Elagabalus intended to show his guests the true suffocating power of his grace. The first petals began to fall.
They drifted at first, like winter's first snow, light and hesitant, catching the flickering light of the scented oil lamps that lined the hall. To the senators and the wealthy socialites reclined upon their embroidered couches, the initial moments were a triumph of aesthetics. They laughed, reaching out to catch the soft velvet fragments of the Roman spring. These were not the wilted scraps of a day-old market stall, but the prime yields of the imperial gardens and the imported riches of Paestum, where the roses bloomed twice a year. The scent was immediate and staggering, a concentrated essence of sweetness that tickled the throat and made the eyes water. Elagabalus, seated upon his elevated dais, watched with a half-smile, his fingers tracing the rim of a chalice carved from a single translucent emerald. He was no longer the boy priest of Emesa in this moment. He was the master of a reality he had constructed, a world where the laws of nature and the mandates of the Senate were secondary to the whims of his senses. To understand the scale of this display, one must consider the logistical nightmare it presented to the imperial household. In the 3rd century, the rose was more than a flower. It was a commodity of immense value, often traded with the same fervor as spice or silk. The coronary, the city's guild of garland makers, would have been pressed into service for weeks, their fingers stained and thorn-pricked as they stripped millions of blossoms. To fill the void above the banquet hall required a harvest that likely depleted the entire floral reserve of the Italian peninsula. The petals had to be kept cool and moist, stored in damp linen in the cavernous basements beneath the Palatine Hill until the very moment they were hoisted into the mechanical false ceilings. This was the boring reality of Roman excess. For every minute of divine spectacle, there were 10,000 hours of grueling, invisible labor. The sheer economy of the petal was a force that could bankrupt a lesser kingdom, yet for the emperor it was merely the necessary price for an evening of unparalleled, fleeting beauty. As the minutes ticked by, the mood in the room began to shift, almost imperceptibly at first. The laughter became more sporadic, replaced by a low murmur of confusion. The petals were no longer a dusting, they were a layer, several inches deep, covering the silver plates and drifting into the wine. A senator, attempting to adjust his position, found his hands sinking deep into the floral mass. The texture, once soft, now felt strangely heavy and damp against his skin. The heat of the room, fueled by the many lamps and the proximity of so many bodies, began to draw the moisture from the petals, creating a thick, cloying humidity. The fragrance, once delightful, was now so dense it felt as though one were breathing perfume directly from the jar. It was a sensory claustrophobia that began to gnaw at the edges of the guests' composure. The Praetorian Guards positioned along the perimeter of the hall remained motionless, though their plumed helmets were now heavy with crimson. They were men of iron and discipline, trained to face the terrifying charge of Germanic tribes or the swift arrows of the Parthians, yet they found themselves being slowly buried by flowers. Their eyes flicked toward the emperor, seeking some sign that the spectacle was over, but Elagabalus was entranced. He watched a particular swirl of white petals as they caught an updraft from a brazier, dancing like spirits before settling into the dark wine of a frightened magistrate. To the emperor, this was the pinnacle of his reign, a total dissolution of the boundary between the beautiful and the terrifying. He leaned back against the ivory supports of his throne, his breathing shallow and rhythmic, lost in a dream of color that transcends the gray, stagnant world of Roman politics and the tedious demands of the state. Above them, the mechanism continued its work. The velaria, the great awnings typically used in the Colosseum, had been adapted for this indoor display. Operated by hidden slaves pulling on silken cords, the panels of the ceiling tilted further, releasing the remaining reserves. The sound was like a long, drawn-out sigh, the collective whisper of a billion fallen petals. It was a sound that muffled the clatter of silverware and the nervous whispers of the guests. It created an acoustic vacuum, a silence that felt heavy and intentional. The room was becoming a tomb of color. The first realization of true danger came when the petals reached the height of the dining couches. The guests, who had been reclining in the traditional Roman fashion, found themselves being submerged. One elderly woman, a distant relative of the Severan dynasty, tried to stand, but her feet slipped on the slick, bruised layers of flora. She fell back with a cry. The petals filled her mouth as she gasped for air. Her companions laughed, thinking it a stumble brought on by the strong Syrian wine, but their laughter died when they saw her struggling to break the surface. The petals were not like water. They did not part easily. They clung, they matted, and they weighed. Each movement only served to pull more petals down into the caps, packing them tighter around the body. Elagabalus leaned forward, his eyes bright with a feverish intensity. He saw the struggle not as a tragedy, but as a choreographic masterpiece. To him, the guests were merely elements in a living painting. He had often spoken of the suffocation of grace, the idea that the soul could be overwhelmed by the sheer presence of the divine. This was his liturgy. While his cousin Alexander Severus studied the dry texts of Stoicism and the boring duties of governance, Elagabalus was exploring the limits of human experience. He did not care for the grain dole or the stability of the frontiers. He cared for the way the crimson of the rose contrasted with the pale skin of a dying aristocrat. By now, the petals were chest high for those still seated. The panic was no longer a subtle undercurrent. It was a palpable wave. Men began to thrash, trying to push the flowers away, but the volume was too great. For every handful they tossed aside, a bucketful fell from the dark recesses of the ceiling. The air was becoming thin. The scent of the roses, once the height of luxury, had turned into a toxic miasma. The sheer biological weight of the organic matter began to generate its own heat, a slow-cooking warmth that added to the guests' distress. They were being buried alive in the most beautiful coffin ever conceived. The doors to the hall, heavy bronze gates adorned with the symbols of the sun god, remained firmly shut. Outside, the sounds of the Roman night continued, the distant shout of a night watchman, the creak of a wagon, but inside the world had shrunk to a room of falling red. The Praetorians, sensing the shift from ceremony to execution, gripped their spear shafts tighter, their knuckles white. They looked only to the emperor, and the emperor looked only at roses.
The emperor's stillness was more terrifying than the chaos unfolding beneath the floral canopy. He sat upon his cushioned dais, a figure of gilded indifference, watching as the crimson tide rose higher, swallowing the ivory legs of the tables and the silver feet of the wine craters. To Elagabalus, this was not a massacre. It was a performance of the highest order, a sublime manifestation of the sun god's power over the fragile beauty of the mortal world. He saw the petals as an extension of his own divinity, a soft, suffocating grace that he was bestowing upon his guests. The screams had begun to change in pitch, transitioning from the sharp, jagged edges of surprise to the low, guttural moans of physical exhaustion. The weight of the roses was deceptive. A single petal weighs nearly nothing, a mere fraction of a gram, but when those fractions are multiplied by several million, they become a crushing geological force. The guests who had been closest to the center of the hall were already completely submerged. Their struggles were visible only as frantic, undulating bulges beneath the red surface, like the movements of some great subterranean beast trying to breach the earth. The air in the room was rapidly deteriorating. As the organic mass of the roses compressed under its own weight, the pockets of breathable oxygen were squeezed out, replaced by a dense saccharine atmosphere of floral decay. There is a specific biological phenomenon known as thermogenesis that occurs when large quantities of plant matter are piled together. As the cells of the roses began to break down, they released heat. Within the hall, the temperature climbed steadily, turning the beautiful tomb into a humid, stifling furnace. The scent, once a delicate luxury imported from the fields of Paestum and the gardens of Egypt, had become an assault on the senses. It was no longer the smell of a garden, it was the smell of a concentrated, fermenting death.
The sweetness was so intense it felt oily, coating the lungs of the struggling men and making every desperate breath a struggle against nausea. Historians have long debated the veracity of this event, often citing the scriptoris Historia Augusta as a source prone to hyperbole and character assassination. Some modern scholars suggest that the account was an invention of the Severan dynasty's detractors, designed to paint Elagabalus as a decadent monster. However, in the context of the boring history of Roman architectural engineering, the possibility of such a device cannot be entirely dismissed. We know that Nero's Domus Aurea featured a rotating banquet hall with panels that could shower guests with flowers and perfumes. Elagabalus, in his obsession with outdoing his predecessors, would have found the mechanical requirements for such a feat well within the capabilities of his court engineers. The logistics would have required a massive network of silk nets and tension-release pulleys hidden within the intricate carvings of the ceiling's coffered panels. It was a triumph of Roman technology applied to the service of a singular, morbid whim. Among the submerged was a man of high standing, perhaps a senator who had once shared a joke with the young emperor in the baths. He fought with a dignity that was rapidly dissolving into primal terror. He could feel the cool velvet touch of the petals against his skin, a sensation that should have been pleasant but was now a nightmare. Each time he tried to push his way upward, more petals slipped into the gaps he created, filling the space around his limbs and pinning him deeper into the mass. His mouth was full of them. The bitter taste of the stems and the soft, dry texture of the blossoms made it impossible to cry out. He was drowning in a sea of red, his vision obscured by the very symbols of love and victory that had adorned his own triumph years before. The irony was likely lost on him as his heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum in the muffled darkness of the rose pile. The Praetorians remained as statues, their eyes fixed forward, though the occasional flicker of a gaze toward the emperor betrayed their unease. These were men hardened by the border wars of the Danube and the sun-scorched campaigns of the East, men who had seen the bloody work of the sword and the spear. But this was something different. There was no glory in this, no enemy to strike down. They were witnessing a quiet, floral annihilation, orchestrated by a boy who wore the purple with a terrifyingly light touch. The guards felt the heat rising from the floor, and the heavy, sweet air began to affect them as well, making their heads light and their breathing shallow. Yet the discipline of the guard was absolute. Until the emperor gave the word, they were merely part of the furniture, witnesses to a divine prerogative that transcended the laws of men. Elagabalus reached out a hand, his fingers adorned with emeralds that caught the flickering light of the torches. He picked up a single rose that had landed on the arm of his throne, turning it slowly between his thumb and forefinger. He seemed fascinated by the geometry of the petals, the way they spiraled inward toward a hidden core. He was a priest of Elagabal, the sun god of Emesa, and to him the world was a series of rituals and symbols. The banquet was a sacrifice, though the victims had not been told they were the offerings. In his mind, he was perhaps elevating them, transforming their mundane political lives into a singular moment of aesthetic perfection. They would die not in the dirt of a battlefield or the squalor of a sickbed, but encased in the most expensive and beautiful substance the empire could provide. It was a gift of supreme decadence, a final, fragrant mercy. As the minutes stretched on, the movement beneath the roses began to subside. The violent heaving of the mounds slowed to a rhythmic twitching, and then, one by one, to a complete standstill. The silence returned to the hall, but it was a different silence than before. It was the heavy, settled quiet of a graveyard. The only sound now was the crackle of the torches, and the distant, muffled sounds of the city outside the bronze doors, a world away from this room of red shadows. The atmospheric pressure in the hall seemed to have changed, the air thick with the invisible weight of the departed. The light from the high windows, what little remained of the dying sun, cast long, distorted shadows across the floral landscape, making the mounds of roses look like a range of low, bloody hills. The emperor finally looked away from the rose in his hand. He surveyed the room, his expression one of mild curiosity, as if he were looking at the aftermath of a particularly long and tiring theatrical performance. The floor of the hall was now entirely invisible, buried under a layer of roses nearly 4 feet deep. Somewhere beneath that layer lay the elite of Rome, their ambitions and grievances silenced forever by a deluge of blossoms. The boy emperor stood up, his silken robes rustling with a sound like dry leaves. He looked at the closed bronze doors, and for a moment a shadow of something human crossed his face. Perhaps boredom, or perhaps the realization that even this spectacle had ended. He had reached the limits of this particular sensation, and already his mind was wandering toward the next. The banquet of roses was over, but the night was still young, and the capricious god emperor of Rome was not yet finished with his world. He stepped down from the dais, his sandals sinking into the soft, yielding carpet of the dead. He walked toward the exit, a lone figure moving across a landscape of crushed beauty, leaving a trail of bruised petals in his wake. The guards followed, their heavy boots making a wet, crunching sound that echoed through the vaulted space. Behind them, the great hall remained a tomb of velvet and gold, a silent testament to the lethal whim of a boy who believed himself a god. The feast was done. The doors of the banquet hall groaned as they were pulled shut from the outside, the heavy thud of the latch echoing like a final hammer blow against the coffin of the Roman aristocracy. Behind those bronze barriers, the silence was now absolute, a stark contrast to the ribald laughter and the frantic, muffled struggles that had preceded the stillness. Elagabalus did not look back. To him, the guests were no longer people. They were merely the discarded remnants of a theatrical performance that had served its purpose. He moved through the dimly lit corridors of the palace, the cloying scent of the crushed roses still clinging to his hair and the intricate folds of his Syrian silk. To the slaves who pressed themselves against the cold marble walls to avoid his path, he was not a boy nor an emperor, but a haunting specter of divine caprice. His eyes were wide, fixed on some internal horizon, perhaps already envisioning the next grand gesture that would shock the sensibilities of a Rome that was rapidly losing its capacity for shock. The night air of the Palatine Hill was uncharacteristically cool, yet it failed to wash away the floral miasma that trailed behind the imperial party. As the emperor ascended to his private quarters, the heavy tread of the Praetorians behind him provided a rhythmic metallic heartbeat to the night. These men, sworn to protect the person of the Caesar, moved with a mechanical precision, their faces masked by the shadows of their crusted helmets. Among them, however, the seeds of a different kind of silence were beginning to take root. They had watched the banquet not with the bored detachment of their master, but with a growing, curdling resentment. They were soldiers of the frontier, men of iron and discipline, and they found themselves serving a priest-king who preferred the company of chariot drivers and the fragrance of exotic blooms to the scent of campfires and blood. The banquet of roses had been a spectacle, yes, but for those who carried the swords, it was a symptom of a sickness that was rotting the very heart of the empire they were sworn to uphold. In the days that followed the fatal feast, the palace became a place of hushed whispers and averted gazes. The disappearance of several high-ranking senators and equestrians was noted, of course, but in the volatile atmosphere of the Severan dynasty, such absences were often treated as a grim necessity of statecraft. Yet the story of the Petals began to leak out, carried by the terrified servants and the grim-faced guards. It became a metaphor for the reign of Elagabalus itself, beautiful, overwhelming, and ultimately suffocating. His grandmother, Julia Maesa, the true power